Veteran Jameson sat on a bench in the park, warming his hands in the pockets of his old coat. The air was damp, and the scent of rain that had just ended lingered. The lights from the street lamps reflected off the wet asphalt, creating a flickering kaleidoscope of light. Jameson loved this place. The park in the city center was a kind of quiet refuge for him. He often sat here after long, sleepless nights, trying to find peace amidst the city's hustle. He didn't immediately notice the boy standing by the old oak tree. A small silhouette, hunched under a hoodie, seemed to blend with the shadows. Jameson felt something familiar, the same look he had seen in his comrades on the front lines when they had to hide their fear behind a mask of indifference. A sudden loud voice made Jameson alert. "Well, Mike, you think you're special," came from the other side of the path. Jameson turned his head. 3 boys stood in front of the thin boy in the gray hoodie. They were older, more confident, and clearly not in a friendly mood. "Give me your phone or we'll help you with that," said one of them, a tall boy with black hair. Mike clenched his fists, but didn't take a step back. Jameson saw how the boy tensed up, swallowing a lump in his throat. "Don't," Mike said quietly. "Just leave me alone." "Oh, look, he's even talking back," laughed another boy. Jameson felt a surge of anger rise within him. His hands instinctively clenched into fists, but he took a deep breath and stood up from the bench. He walked swiftly toward the boys. "Is everything all right?" he asked calmly, yet firmly, standing between Mike and the older boys. The 3 of them exchanged glances. "And what's it to you?" muttered the one holding the phone. "I think the boy asked you to leave him alone." Jameson's voice was steady, but there was an undeniable force in it that he made no attempt to hide. "And what if we don't?" one of them asked insolently, flashing a crooked smile. Jameson took a step forward, stopping almost nose to nose with the boy. His eyes turned cold and serious. "If not, we'll have to talk." He didn't raise his voice, but his tone carried the confidence of someone who had seen much worse. For a moment, silence hung in the air. One of the boys nervously rubbed the back of his neck. "Let's go," the older boy said. "It's not worth it." They turned and disappeared into the park's darkness, leaving behind only the muffled sound of footsteps on the wet asphalt. Mike stood there, breathing heavily, his face tense. Jameson approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Mike nodded, wiping his face with his hand. "They do this all the time," he said quietly. "And no one ever helps." Jameson looked at the boy attentively. Today, someone helped. Mike raised his gaze and for the first time met Jameson's eyes. "Thank you," he said. Jameson lightly patted him on the shoulder. "Let's go." "How about some hot chocolate?" he smiled. Mike hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. They walked through the park, leaving behind only the rustling of the wind in the treetops and the quiet splashing of puddles beneath their feet. Jameson stood in the shadow of the building, watching Mike, who, with his head lowered, tried to avoid blows and humiliation. Jameson's heart clenched. His instincts screamed for him to intervene immediately, sharply, ruthlessly, the way he had been trained to act during the war. But this time, he knew that force wouldn't change anything. He took a deep breath, gathered his thoughts, and confidently but calmly moved forward. The group of boys didn't notice him right away. Jameson didn't shout or wave his arms. He simply approached and stood beside Mike. "Is this some kind of game?" Jameson's voice was low and even, yet there was an icy firmness to it. The 3 boys took a step back, exchanging glances. One of them, a tall boy with dark hair, straightened his shoulders. "And what's it to you?" He tried to make his voice harsh, but there was a note of uncertainty in it. Jameson directed his gaze at him, a deep, steady stare, the same one he used when facing enemies in the hottest spots of the world. "If you want to settle things, start with me," he said calmly. We were just joking." Another boy, a redhead with freckles, took another step back. "Joking." Jameson slightly tilted his head. "A real joke is when everyone laughs, not just you 3. Mike raised his head. There were still traces of tears on his face, but his eyes now sparkled with wonder and hope. "Go," Jameson said quietly but firmly. The boys hesitated. The dark-haired boy paused for a second, then abruptly turned and walked away. The other two followed him. Jameson waited until they disappeared around the corner. Then he crouched down in front of Mike, so their eyes were level. "Are you all right?" he asked. Mike nodded, wiping his tears with his sleeve. "Thank you." His voice was hoarse from emotion. They do this a lot." Jameson gently placed his hand on Mike's shoulder. "They won't anymore," he said calmly. Mike looked up at him. "How do you know?" Jameson paused for a moment. The images of war flashed before his eyes again, tired faces of comrades, the cold of desert nights, the sound of gunfire in the dark. He had seen how fear made people cruel. But he also knew that understanding and support were the things that could change everything. "Because now they know you're not alone," Jameson answered. Mike stared at him, wide-eyed. "Let's go," Jameson suggested, standing up. "You need to recharge. I know a place that serves the best burgers in town." Mike smiled, though his eyes still glistened with tears. He stood up, and Jameson gently patted him on the back. They walked down the street, Mike a little unsure, Jameson calm and confident. "Weren't you scared to stand up to them?" Mike asked. Jameson smiled slightly at the corner of his mouth. "Being scared is normal, but the key is not letting fear control you." Mike nodded, thoughtful. They turned the corner, and Jameson felt the boy move a little closer to him. Jameson had a feeling that this day was the beginning of something important for Mike and possibly for him too. They arrived at a small place on the corner of the street. Inside, the smell of fried meat and freshly baked bread filled the air. Jameson chose a table by the window, where he could see the street. Mike hesitantly sat across from him, nervously fiddling with the sleeve of his sweater. "What will you have?" Jameson asked, picking up the menu. "I don't know." Mike shrugged. "I've never been here before." Jameson smiled. "Then trust me." He ordered 2 double burgers with fries and a Coke. Mike silently watched as the waiter left with the order. Jameson noticed how the boy fidgeted nervously in his seat. "Have you been in this neighborhood long?" Jameson asked, trying to ease the tension. "My mom moved me to this school 6 months ago," Mike sighed. "She said it would be a fresh start. But everything just got worse." Jameson nodded. "It's tough being the new kid. I know what that's like." Mike looked up, surprised. "You were the new kid?" Jameson smiled, a bit sadly. "At every military base they sent me to, I was the new guy. And there everything was settled quickly. Either you show you can stand up for yourself, or they'll eat you alive." Mike seemed a little more animated. "You were in the Army?" "Marine," Jameson clarified. 7 years. That's cool." Mike looked impressed. "And hard," Jameson added. "I saw the worst sides of people." The waiter brought their food. Mike looked at his burger, hesitating. Jameson picked up his burger and took a big bite. "Try it," he winked. Mike cautiously took the burger, took a small bite, then another, bigger one. "Wow, this is really good." "Told you so," Jameson smiled. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Jameson noticed Mike starting to relax, the tension in his shoulders disappearing. "What about your dad?" Jameson asked carefully. Mike lowered his eyes. "He left a few years ago. He told Mom he'd come back, but he didn't. Must be tough without him." Mike nodded. "Mom works a lot, so we can pay for the apartment. She's almost always busy. That's why I spend a lot of time alone." Jameson felt a familiar weight in his chest. His own father had left him when he was 11. "Listen, Mike." Jameson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You're not alone. If anyone tries to mess with you again, tell me. I'll help." "Really?" Mike looked at him with wide eyes. "I don't leave my own," Jameson said seriously. Mike smiled. "Thank you." They finished their burgers and walked out onto the street. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. "I'll walk you home," Jameson offered. "I can manage." "I insist," Jameson smiled. They walked down the sidewalk. Mike stayed a little closer to Jameson, as if seeking protection. Jameson noticed, but said nothing. When they reached Mike's house, the boy stopped by the door. Mike awkwardly rubbed his neck. "Thanks for everything." "No problem," Jameson replied. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." Mike nodded and was about to enter the house when he suddenly turned back. Can I write to you?" Jameson smiled. "Always." Mike disappeared behind the door, and Jameson stayed on the sidewalk. He stared at the house for a few seconds, then slowly began walking toward his apartment. His life had been chaotic and empty for a long time. But now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd done something right. He smiled to himself. "You're not alone, kid," he whispered. "Not anymore." The next few weeks flew by. Jameson and Mike started spending more time together. At first, it was short phone calls. Then they met a few times on the basketball court. Jameson taught Mike some Marine Corps techniques, how to defend himself, how to keep balance, how to react quickly in a dangerous situation. Mike began to change. He no longer walked with hunched shoulders, and there was newfound confidence in his eyes. One day, he even mentioned that the boys at school had stopped picking on him. "I think they sensed I'm not so weak anymore," Mike said, smiling. Jameson was proud of him. He saw in Mike the younger version of himself, lost, lonely, searching for support. And now, he felt he had the chance to give him what he never had back then. One evening, as Jameson was returning home after training, his phone rang. It was Mike. "Hello. Can you come over?" Mike's voice sounded quiet and anxious. "What happened?" Jameson quickly threw on his jacket. "My mom. She didn't come home from work. I called her, but her phone is off." "I'm on my way," Jameson replied, leaving his apartment. He reached Mike's house in a few minutes. Mike opened the door, his eyes red from crying. "She always calls when she's running late." Mike trembled. "We'll find her," Jameson said firmly. They began calling hospitals, the police. There was no information anywhere. Jameson saw how Mike was starting to panic, so he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe. Together. In two. Mike nodded and started to breathe evenly. Suddenly, Mike lifted his head. "She has a friend, Sarah. She works at a cafe around the corner. Maybe Mom said something to her." "Let's check," Jameson said. They rushed to the cafe. Sarah had just finished her shift. "Oh, Mike." She waved her hand. "What's wrong?" "Have you seen my mom? She hasn't come back from work." Sarah paused to think. "She mentioned she was going to check out some new supermarket after work. I think it's on Lincoln Street." Jameson and Mike rushed to Lincoln Street. On the way, Jameson noticed a police car parked at the side of the road, with a crowd of people gathered around. Something happened there. Mike whispered. Jameson approached one of the officers. "What happened here?" "A woman was mugged by the supermarket. She's unconscious, but the medics say she'll be fine." "How does she look?" Jameson asked. The officer described her. Mike was already running toward the ambulance. "That's her," he yelled. Jameson and Mike ran to the ambulance. Mike's mom was lying on a stretcher, her head bandaged, but she was conscious. "Mike." She reached out her hand. "Mom." Mike rushed to her, grabbing her hand. "She'll be fine," the medic assured them. Mike cried, but this time it was out of relief. Jameson stood by, watching them. When the medics took her to the hospital, Mike approached Jameson. "If it weren't for you." "I told you," Jameson replied, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm always here." The next day, Jameson visited Mike at the hospital. Mike's mom was feeling better. She thanked Jameson for his help. "I don't know what we would have done without you," she said, holding her son's hand. "It's going to be okay," Jameson replied. Now Mike knows he's not alone. As they left the hospital, Jameson felt Mike approach him. "Are you Still going to train me?" Jameson smiled. "Definitely. But now not just at training." Mike's face lit up with a smile. "Thank you. For everything." "Anytime," Jameson said, placing his hand on Mike's shoulder. "We've got your back, Mike. Always." They walked down the street together, and for the first time in a long while, Jameson felt warmth in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Mike.